Good evening to all the beautiful people tuning in. I'm here to help you sleep. Please support me by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. I'm also curious to know where you're watching from and at what time, so drop a comment below. Are you ready? Let's start with the first story.
The title of the story, The Forgotten Mansion, Unveiling the Dark Past. The wind howled through the trees as the group of friends made their way deeper into the forest. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, but beneath it all lingered something colder, more unnatural. Hannah, the leader of the group, pushed her way through the underbrush with a grin. "It's just up ahead," she said, her voice betraying a mix of excitement and nervousness. Her friends, Alex, Katie, and Max, followed closely behind, their eyes darting around the dense woods, unsure of what awaited them. The mansion had been a topic of local folklore for years, its name whispered with a mixture of fear and fascination. Abandoned for decades, it stood hidden in the forest, almost forgotten by time. No one in town ever spoke about it openly, but every so often a tale would slip through the cracks, a story of strange happenings, of ghostly figures glimpsed in the windows, of a family that had disappeared without a trace. The group had heard the stories, but they had never believed them. It was just an old house, after all. What harm could it really do? When they finally arrived, the mansion loomed ahead, its silhouette dark against the setting sun. The younger grand structure was now a decaying husk, its windows boarded up, the stone walls covered in thick vines. The front door hung loosely on its hinges, creaking in the wind as though beckoning them inside. "Well, here we are," Katie said, her voice tinged with hesitation. "What now?" "We go in," Hannah replied with a daring smile. She pushed open the door with an exaggerated flourish, and the group followed her inside. The moment they crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped. The air was thick, stifling with the smell of mold, mildew, and something faintly metallic like blood. A cold draft swept through the halls, sending a chill down their spines. The interior of the house was shrouded in shadow, the faded remnants of its former opulence barely visible through layers of dust and decay. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of wind whistling through broken windows. It felt as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. The creaking of floorboards under their feet echoed in the empty hall, amplifying the tension. Max, the most skeptical of the group, raised an eyebrow. "It's just an old house. Don't get all freaked out, guys." But Alex, who had been unusually quiet, looked around nervously. "It feels wrong," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Hannah ignored them, her curiosity outweighing the growing unease. She led them down a dark corridor, her footsteps slow and deliberate. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, peeling in places, revealing old warped wood underneath. Each room they passed seemed frozen in time, a once beautiful space now ravaged by neglect. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, but the strange feeling of being watched only intensified with every step. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the room they had just passed, the sound of a door slamming shut, though no one had touched it. The group froze. "What the hell was that?" Katie asked, her voice cracking slightly. "It's probably the wind," Max said, but there was no confidence in his tone. They continued forward, their nerves fraying as the sounds of the house grew louder. Distant whispers, soft but unmistakable, drifting from the shadows. The temperature seemed to drop even further, their breath misting in the air. They came to a large open room at the back of the house, a grand staircase, now rotting with age, spiraled upwards. The walls were adorned with faded portraits of the mansion's former occupants, pale, stern-looking faces that seemed to follow them with their eyes. As they moved through the room, their footsteps caused the floorboards to groan under their weight, the sound reverberating unnervingly through the silence. "This place is creepy as hell," Max muttered. "I think we should get out of here."
But Hannah was already moving toward an old, dusty bookshelf against the far wall. Her fingers brushed against the spines of the books, some of which were completely decayed, the pages crumbling away. She pulled one from the shelf, its cover so worn that the title was illegible. When she opened it, however, a collection of strange sketches fell out. Drawings of twisted figures, their faces obscured, but their expressions filled with a sense of deep despair. The sketches were crude, yet there was something haunting about them. They were almost lifelike, as if the artist had captured a glimpse of something beyond the living world. "Look at this," Hannah said, holding up the drawings. "These are strange." Katie and Alex gathered around, peering at the pages in the dim light. "Who would draw something like this?" Katie whispered, her voice filled with unease. Alex flipped through the rest of the book, finding more disturbing images. People trapped in dark, shadowy corners, their limbs twisted unnaturally, eyes wide in terror. The final sketch was the most chilling. A figure standing in the doorway of a room, its face obscured by shadows, but its hands raised in what seemed to be a plea for help. The book slipped from Hannah's hands, falling to the floor with a soft thud. The house seemed to shudder, the walls groaning under an invisible weight. Then, as though reacting to their discovery, the temperature plummeted, their breath becoming visible in the air. The whispers grew louder, now unmistakable. "Get out," a voice hissed, barely audible but unmistakable. The group jumped, their hearts pounding in their chests. "Did you hear that?" Katie asked, her face pale. "It's just the wind," Max insisted, but his voice wavered. He was starting to look just as frightened as the rest of them. Suddenly, the door to the room slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping them inside. "We need to get out now," Alex shouted, grabbing the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Hannah's eyes darted to the portraits on the walls, the faces now twisted in grotesque, contorted expressions. "We are not alone," she whispered, stepping back, her hand trembling as it brushed against the peeling wallpaper. A piece of it tore away, revealing something hidden behind it. A journal. She pulled it free, flipping it open to the first page.
The handwriting was faded, but legible. The house hungers. It waits. We are trapped here, our souls bound to its walls. The artist, too, was never free. He had to paint us, to trap us. He could not leave. Neither can we, and neither will they. The journal fell from her hands as a cold, oppressive presence filled the room. The door rattled violently, as if something on the other side was trying to break through. The walls groaned, the floorboards creaked under unseen footsteps. "We need to find a way out," Alex said, panic rising in his voice. But as they scrambled toward the door, they realized something horrifying. Nothing was the same. The hallway outside had changed. The rooms were not where they should have been. Every turn they took led them back to the same place, the same room, as though the house had folded in on itself. Then it hit them. They weren't just trapped in the house. They were trapped in time. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and as the shadows crept closer, they finally understood the truth. The mansion's former occupants, those faces in the portraits, the twisted figures in the drawings, were still there, waiting, not dead, but not truly alive either. And they weren't the only ones who had come seeking answers. Hannah turned, eyes wide with realization. "We need to leave, now, the house. It's been waiting for us." But by then, it was too late. The doors to the mansion would not open again, and the house had already chosen its new occupants.
The title of the story: Whispers of the Abandoned House. It was late afternoon when Amelia stood before the overgrown iron gate that led into the house. The once pristine property now lay in ruins, draped in shadows as the sun slowly sank beneath the horizon. Her heartbeat quickened. This was it. The house she had been told stories about for years, the house everyone in town avoided. The locals called it the Silent House, but to Amelia it was always just the place where her curiosity had festered, building a hunger for answers. The house loomed like a forgotten relic, its windows blank eyes that had stared out into the world for too long. As Amelia pushed open the rusted gate, a gust of wind seemed to breathe life into the surroundings. The door, which hung ajar, creaked in protest when she nudged it open further. The smell of mildew and decay hit her in a wave as she stepped inside, her footfalls muted by the thick dust that covered every surface. The air inside was thick with the weight of time. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional drip of water from the roof. She glanced around, her eyes tracing the peeling wallpaper, the cracked wooden floorboards, and the cobwebs that draped the corners of the room like eerie curtains. It was only when she ventured deeper into the hallway that she began to hear it. Faint, almost imperceptible whispers. She paused, straining her ears. They were coming from behind the walls, too faint to understand, but definitely there. The sound sent a chill down her spine. She shook her head, trying to dismiss it as the wind, but the whispers continued, growing louder as she made her way through the hallway. With each step, the atmosphere thickened. A door ahead of her creaked open by itself, its hinges protesting in a screech that seemed to echo throughout the house. Emilia flinched, but she pushed forward, driven by a need to discover what lay within. She entered the room, the faint light filtering through the grimy window, casting long shadows across the furniture. The whispers seemed to be coming from everywhere now, as if the very walls of the house were speaking to her. They weren't just voices, they were words, barely audible, murmuring in a language she couldn't understand. Her heart hammered in her chest as she took a few more steps, her eyes darting around the room. A heavy silence hung in the air, and then, without warning, the whispers stopped. Suddenly, the house seemed to breathe. The floorboards groaned under an invisible weight, and the room grew colder. Emilia's breath misted in the air before her, and her skin prickled with unease. Her hands trembled as she reached for the faded photograph on the mantelpiece. It depicted a family, a mother, father, and 2 children, smiling in front of this very house, their faces frozen in a time long past. But something about the photograph was wrong. The eyes of the children were too wide, their smiles too forced, as if they knew something terrible that the rest of the world did not. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the image, and that's when she heard it again. The whispers, louder now, so close that they seemed to be coming from just behind her.
Spinning around, she found the room empty. There was no one there. The whispers, however, continued, now accompanied by soft thuds, like footsteps moving from room to room. She turned and ran down the hallway towards the back of the house. The further she went, the more intense the whispers became. They felt like they were wrapping around her, suffocating her. As she approached the staircase leading down to the basement, a cold draft sent a shiver through her spine. She hesitated, but then heard the unmistakable sound of someone breathing. She wasn't alone. With no choice but to continue, Emilia descended into the dark cellar. The air down here was thick, cloying with the scent of rot. The faint glow of her phone's flashlight illuminated rows of old forgotten objects, broken furniture, crates of dusty books, and remnants of a time long past. But as her eyes scanned the space, something caught her attention. A large, weathered trunk partially hidden in the corner. The whispers, now rising in intensity, seemed to beckon her. She felt an overwhelming pull toward the trunk. Her hand trembled as she reached for the latch, and when it opened, the air seemed to freeze. Inside the trunk were old belongings, clothes, toys, and something else. She reached in and pulled out a small yellow journal. It had a leather cover, cracked with age, but the pages inside were still legible. Flipping through the pages, she found a chilling account of the family in the photograph, one that spoke of strange occurrences, dark rituals, and voices that never stopped whispering. The last entry was dated several months before the house was abandoned. "They know what I did. They're coming for me. They never leave." The whispers suddenly stopped, and the room was plunged into an unbearable silence. Emilia's eyes darted around the cellar, and she realized with a shock that the trunk was no longer there. In its place, a mirror stood reflecting her own wide-eyed face. Before she could react, a voice, calm and soft, echoed from behind her. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered, its tone familiar, almost comforting. Amelia turned. The woman standing there, her mother, smiled gently, her eyes wide and unsettling. She stepped closer, the air around her thick with the scent of mildew and decay. And in that moment, Amelia realized the house was never abandoned. It was waiting for her.
The title of the story, The Haunted Asylum, Echoes from the Past. It was a crisp autumn morning when the group of urban explorers pulled up to the rusted gates of St. Ethel's Psychiatric Asylum deep in the woods of New England. The car's tires crunched over the gravel driveway as the trees surrounding the abandoned building whispered in the cold breeze. A feeling of unease settled over them, but none of them spoke it aloud. They were here for one reason: to explore. The rumors had always lingered, whispers of strange happenings and dark secrets, but curiosity outweighed any reservations they might have had. The group consisted of 5: Theo, the leader and most experienced in urban exploration; Emily, the photographer who had a way of capturing the haunting beauty of decay; Lucas, the skeptic, always quick to dismiss anything that couldn't be explained; Ava, the sensitive one, attuned to the unseen; and Ben, the joker, who made light of even the most terrifying situations. "All right, let's do this," Theo said, his voice cutting through the silence. He grinned as he led the group to the gate, which creaked loudly as he pushed it open. The asylum loomed before them, an imposing structure with crumbling stone walls, shattered windows, and ivy crawling over its exterior like fingers reaching for escape. The air felt heavy as they stepped inside, the smell of mildew and decay assaulting their senses. The building had been abandoned for decades after a series of unethical experiments were exposed. Experiments that had left scars on the people who had once been patients. Yet the truth of what had happened here remained buried, overshadowed by rumors and urban legends. Ava felt a chill crawl up her spine as they walked deeper into the asylum. "Do you guys feel that?" she whispered, but no one replied. The others were too busy filming, snapping pictures, and joking around to notice. Their footsteps echoed off the hollow walls as they moved further into the darkened hallways. Each step was met with the distant groan of wood and the subtle creak of metal, as if the building itself was alive, sighing under its own weight. The light from their flashlights flickered in time with their unease, casting eerie shadows across peeling wallpaper and stained floors. "So, what's the deal with this place?" Lucas asked, his voice low and dismissive as he pulled out his phone to check the time. "It looks like a dump." "Yeah, but there's something about it, right?" Ben replied, grinning. "It's got that creepy hospital vibe." Emily held up her camera, capturing shots of the decaying remnants of what had once been patient rooms. She paused, her lens trained on a set of rusted surgical tools scattered across a metal table. "These look like something straight out of a horror movie." Theo nodded. The place shut down after they were caught performing experimental treatments on patients, electroshock, lobotomies, and worse. Some say they were trying to cure the patients through brutal methods. They passed through an old hallway and entered what appeared to be a former common room, now overrun with debris. A chill in the air seemed to intensify, but the group shrugged it off as they explored the room. Ben reached out to touch the cold, cracked wall, only to recoil suddenly. "Did you hear that?" Ava whispered, her eyes wide as she scanned the room.
It sounded like footsteps. The others laughed it off. "It's just the building settling," Lucas said, smirking. "Nothing to be afraid of." But Ava didn't feel reassured. Her skin prickled, the sensation of being watched creeping over her. She thought she saw something move in the corner of her eye, something dark, something fleeting. They continued on, their exploration taking them through narrow corridors and stairwells. As they ventured deeper, the atmosphere grew heavier, the oppressive weight of the place pressing in on them. The temperature seemed to drop, and their breath turned to mist as they moved. The air was thick with the scent of rot and decay, but there was something more, a faint trace of something metallic, like blood, that they couldn't quite place.
They entered a room that appeared to have once been a patient's quarters, its walls lined with peeling paint and broken furniture. Beneath the dust and cobwebs, remnants of old patient files were scattered across the floor. Emily knelt to pick one up, her flashlight illuminating the words on the faded paper. The name on the file was familiar: Mary Donovan, a patient who had disappeared from St. Ethel's decades ago. "Look at this," Emily said, holding up the file for the others to see. "It's one of the patients who went missing." Ava's stomach twisted, and she backed away from the file. "Something's wrong here," she muttered, her voice barely a whisper. "We shouldn't be here." Theo, ever the skeptic, scoffed. "It's just an old file. There's nothing wrong with being here. We're just exploring." But even Theo couldn't deny the sense of foreboding creeping up his spine as the others flipped through the remaining files. The names, the dates, they were all too real, too close. And as they examined the files, a soft sound reached their ears, a whisper, faint but unmistakable. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Suddenly the lights flickered and went out. The room was swallowed by darkness, save for the weak glow of their flashlights. "What the hell was that?" Ben said, his voice a little less confident now. He fumbled with his flashlight, but it only flickered again. A cold gust of air swept through the room, and then the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, came from the hallway. The group froze, their hair on the back of their necks standing on end. It was impossible. They had heard no one else enter the building. Ava's heart raced. "We're not alone," she whispered, her voice trembling. Theo's eyes darted toward the doorway. "It's probably just another group of explorers." But as they stepped toward the door, a door at the end of the hallway slammed shut with a deafening crash. They jumped, and the sound of a low, guttural growl echoed from the darkness beyond. "Let's get out of here," Lucas urged, his usual bravado gone. The group quickly turned to leave, but as they passed through the hallway, a door they hadn't noticed before creaked open on its own, revealing a dimly lit room. Inside, a figure stood. At first they thought it was one of them, but as their eyes adjusted to the dim light, they saw it clearly, a woman, pale and gaunt, dressed in an old hospital gown. Her eyes were wide and empty, staring directly at them, her mouth twitching as if trying to form words that never came. The air grew thick, suffocating, as a voice filled the room, soft, sad, almost pleading. "Why did you come?"
Before anyone could respond, the figure collapsed into the shadows, vanishing without a trace. Ben was the first to break the silence. Did anyone else see that?" "I saw it," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "We need to leave, now!" But it was too late. The asylum had made its choice. As they rushed back toward the exit, the doors slammed shut behind them, trapping them in the depths of St. Ethel's. The air became oppressive, the whispers louder now, as if the very walls were alive with the tortured voices of the past. Something was following them. They reached the front gates, but as they pushed through the rusted metal, they realized with a sickening jolt that they hadn't left the asylum at all. They were still inside, and the truth hit them all at once. One of them, the quiet one, had never been part of the group. The woman who had led them into the depths of darkness was not a stranger at all. She was one of the lost souls of St. Ethel's, a spirit trapped between the realms of the living and the dead. The very same experiment that had twisted the lives of countless others had claimed her long ago. But now she had come for them.
The title of the story, The Cursed Manor, Secrets Beneath the Floorboards. The manor stood at the edge of the forest, its towering silhouette a ghostly reminder of a bygone era. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, and the moon cast a pale, eerie glow over the decaying structure. Inside, the floorboards creaked with every step, and the faint rustle of something unseen stirred the air. The house seemed to breathe. As the group of young adventurers stepped onto the gravel path leading to the front door, an unsettling sensation washed over them. No one had entered the manor in decades, not since the disappearance of its last occupants, an old family that, according to local legend, had vanished without a trace, leaving only the whispers of a curse behind them. "Are we sure about this?" asked Hannah, her voice barely a whisper as she looked up at the imposing structure. "Of course we are," replied Matt, the most daring of the group, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "It's just an old house. No ghosts, no curses, just dust and spiders." But the second they stepped inside, they realized just how wrong Matt was. The air was thick with dust, and the silence was deafening. The walls, once adorned with fine tapestries, were now stripped bare, their once beautiful surfaces now cracked and peeling. The faint smell of mildew lingered in the air, and a heavy fog seemed to curl around their feet. The group made their way through the grand hall, their footsteps muffled by the rotting carpets that covered the floors. They explored room after room, finding nothing but remnants of a forgotten past, faded portraits of the long-gone family, broken furniture, and cracked mirrors. "Let's head down to the basement," Matt suggested, his voice low and tense. "If there's anything interesting down here, it's got to be hidden in the dark." The stairs leading to the basement creaked under their weight, and the smell of dampness grew stronger the further they descended. As they reached the bottom, they found themselves standing in a small stone-walled room, the air colder than the rest of the house. The floorboards, warped by time, seemed to groan with the weight of history. Then Hannah's flashlight flickered and revealed something strange, an indentation in the floor, almost as if a portion of it had been removed and replaced hastily. Her heart raced as she knelt down, running her fingers over the edges. "I think we found something," she said, her voice trembling with curiosity. With a creak, the floorboard lifted, revealing a small, hidden compartment. Inside, a rusted metal door handle gleamed in the dim light. Matt's eyes widened. "This is it! This is what we came for!" With a single forceful tug, Matt pulled the door open. A musty smell rose from the darkness beneath it. They descended the narrow staircase, their lights catching on something that made them all pause. On a pedestal, bathed in an unnatural glow, sat a book. Its cover was made of dark, cracked leather, and strange symbols were etched into its surface.
"What is this?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "Only one way to find out," Matt said, already reaching for it. He opened the book, flipping through the brittle pages. The text was in a language none of them recognized, but the symbols on the pages seemed to twist and writhe as if alive. His finger traced over the inked words, and when he reached a particularly elaborate phrase, he murmured it aloud. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and the floorboards above them groaned in protest. The whispers began, faint at first, like the soft murmur of a distant crowd, but as the last word left Matt's lips, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. The walls of the manor seemed to vibrate with an unnatural energy. "Matt, what did you do?" Hannah's voice cracked with fear. The room began to pulse with a cold, oppressive presence. The air thickened and the whispers became louder, twisting into words they could barely understand. Shadows began to stretch unnaturally across the stone walls. "We need to leave, now," Sarah urged, her voice panicked. They scrambled up the stairs, but the basement door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. They were trapped. The air grew colder, and the shadows in the corners of the room began to take shape. Faint figures flickered in the periphery of their vision, twisted, grotesque faces, eyes hollow and staring. Suddenly, the portraits on the walls came to life. The eyes of the painted ancestors of the manor followed their every move, their painted smiles turning into sneers. The whispers in the walls grew to an unbearable pitch. Matt's hand shook as he reached for the door, but it was no use. The house wasn't just trapping them, it was alive, feeding off their fear. They ran, each footstep echoing through the cursed halls, but the manor seemed to stretch endlessly before them. Every hallway led to the same place, every door opening to more shadows, more whispers, more figures. "We have to return the book," Sarah screamed. "It's the only way to stop this." As they raced back to the basement, they found that the book had vanished from the pedestal. Desperately, they searched the room, but it was as if the manor had swallowed it whole. The whispers had stopped, and the shadows disappeared, leaving only an eerie silence. And then, as if on cue, a voice, soft, haunting and clear, whispered from the darkness behind them, "You have set us free." When they turned, the room was empty, the manor as still and silent as it had been when they first entered. The book, the shadows, the whispers, gone. But one thing remained, a single fresh footprint in the dust beneath their feet. The manor was no longer cursed. It had been set free.
The title of the story: The Abandoned Mansion, The Ghosts of Forgotten Souls. The night air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves as the group of friends made their way down the overgrown path leading to the mansion. Their flashlight beams cut through the oppressive darkness, illuminating their eager faces as they whispered excitedly among themselves. Emily, the most adventurous of the group, had stumbled upon an old map in an antique shop, one that promised to lead to an abandoned mansion hidden deep within the woods. "It's going to be epic," she'd said, flashing them a grin that seemed to challenge the unease gnawing at their stomachs. The mansion loomed ahead, its silhouette outlined against the darkened sky, a jagged ruin of faded glory. Its towering spires and broken windows cast an unsettling presence, like a watchful, slumbering beast. As they reached the front steps, the door, surprisingly intact despite the years, creaked open as though inviting them inside. The interior was even more imposing. Dust-choked air clung to the heavy velvet curtains, their once luxurious fabric now faded and threadbare. The grand staircase stretched upward into shadow, its banister twisted and broken in places. Every floorboard groaned beneath their feet, protesting each step they took, as if the house was still alive, listening, waiting. "Do you think anyone's been here?" Tom asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I doubt it," Emily responded, her voice strong despite the chill creeping up her spine. "It's been abandoned for decades." They wandered deeper, the house growing darker with each turn. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of old wood or the rustle of something in the corners. Suddenly, as they passed a hallway lined with portraits, Emily froze. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a door at the end of the corridor. It was ajar, an eerie blue light flickering within. Inside, they found themselves in a vast room, its walls covered in the most unusual paintings. The figures in the portraits were strangers, their eyes cold and unblinking, yet there was something oddly familiar about them, as if they were waiting for the group to come closer. Emily stepped forward, drawn to the largest painting, one of a woman with hollow eyes. "Do you think these people are real?" Emily asked, her voice a little unsteady. "I don't know," murmured Sarah, her voice tinged with dread. "This place is giving me a bad feeling." Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the mansion, making them jump. The door slammed shut behind them. They turned around, but there was no one there. A cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candles they had lit, plunging them into darkness. They heard it then, a low whisper, like voices carried on the wind. "Get out! Leave before it's too late." The words were barely audible, but unmistakable. "Who's there?" Tom called out, his voice shaking. Is someone playing tricks on us?
But no answer came. The whispers grew louder until they were almost deafening. Emily, with a mix of dread and fascination, stepped closer to the nearest painting. The woman's face twisted into a grotesque grin, and her eyes seemed to follow Emily as she moved. The group backed away, their breath catching in their throats. Then, to their horror, the paintings began to change. The faces that had once been frozen in time now shifted and contorted, the smiles morphing into sinister sneers. The woman in the largest painting suddenly looked directly at them, her mouth opening in an unnatural, bone-crunching way. Her voice, now clearer than ever, echoed through the room. "Leave, or become one of us." The group scrambled to the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped. "I told you this place was cursed," Sarah said, her eyes wide with terror. "We should have left when we had the chance." Then the floorboards beneath them began to creak, and the air thickened. The room seemed to pulse with an energy, like something was waking up from a long slumber. And in the shadows, figures began to materialize, faint outlines at first, but slowly becoming more solid, more real. The spirits of the mansion, once trapped in their portraits, had begun to stir, their forms now writhing and twisting, their faces no longer human, but grotesque caricatures of their former selves. Their eyes were filled with hunger and malice, and they reached out with long, clawed fingers. Emily, heart racing, realized with horror that these were not just any spirits. The mansion had become a prison for these souls, bound by an ancient ritual gone wrong. They had been trapped here for centuries, and now they sought release through the blood of the living. Suddenly, the voices stopped, and an eerie silence fell over the room. The figures vanished. The door creaked open. Without hesitation, the group fled, heartbeats thundering in their chests. As they burst out into the night, the mansion seemed to fall silent once more. But as they looked back one last time, they saw something that sent chills crawling down their spines. The faces from the paintings, each one now staring out of the mansion's windows. And then, just before they turned to run, Emily heard one final whisper, faint but clear. "Thank you for setting us free." The house, it seemed, no longer needed to trap them. They were now part of the mansion's collection, just as the forgotten souls had been before them.
The title of the story, Echoes in the Hollow House. Nestled deep in the heart of an abandoned forest, the Hollow House stood as a grim monument to a time long forgotten. Its skeletal frame loomed against the gray sky, the once grand estate now a shadow of its former self. The walls, covered in ivy and decay, whispered the sorrow of years left unattended. For decades the house had been abandoned, but locals spoke of eerie sounds, creaking floors, whispers carried by the wind, and the flicker of lights in its darkened windows at night. The tales, rife with mystery, were enough to keep even the bravest souls at bay. None had dared to enter, until now. A group of paranormal investigators, led by the determined Sarah Grant, had arrived in the small, remote town at the foot of the forest. Their mission was clear: uncover the truth behind the hollow house and the unexplained phenomena that had surrounded it for generations. Sarah was an experienced investigator, known for her skepticism and her knack for unraveling even the most convoluted of mysteries. Accompanied by a seasoned team, Tom, a former historian with a deep interest in the house's past, Rachel, an empathic medium with an unsettling connection to the supernatural, and James, a tech specialist with a keen eye for capturing the unexplainable, they made their way toward the house. The air felt dense, oppressive as they approached the house, the forest around them eerily silent, as though nature itself was holding its breath. The hollow house stood at the end of a long, overgrown path, its rotting timbers a stark contrast to the vibrant life that surrounded it. The house seemed to watch them with its dark windows, as though waiting for them to step inside. "You sure you want to go in there?" Tom's voice was low, tinged with unease. Sarah paused, surveying the house. "We're here for the truth. Whatever it is, we have to face it." With that, the team made their way up the creaky front steps and into the house. The door, heavy and weathered, groaned as they pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty space like the warning of a long-forgotten ghost. As they entered, a cold draft swept through the hallway, carrying with it the scent of damp wood and rot. The interior was dimly lit, the dust in the air making everything appear hazy, as if the house itself were a half-remembered dream. "Something's off," Rachel whispered, her breath visible in the cold air. Sarah nodded, her eyes scanning the shadows. It wasn't just the coldness that unsettled her. It was the house's oppressive silence, as if the walls themselves were waiting for something. The sound of creaking wood underfoot filled the otherwise eerie quiet as they ventured further into the house. They made their way down the main hallway, their footsteps reverberating against the walls, the only sound accompanying them in the silence. The house seemed to hum with a strange energy, and even Tom, ever the skeptic, couldn't deny that something felt wrong. Rachel stopped, her face pale. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice shaky. The others strained to listen, but the silence was unbroken. "What are you talking about?" James asked, holding up a flashlight.
"I hear footsteps," she murmured, her eyes wide with growing fear. Everyone fell still, their hearts pounding. Sarah squinted into the darkness ahead. Nothing. But then, from the far end of the hallway, came the unmistakable sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. The team froze. No one was in front of them. No one had entered the house after them. Yet the footsteps were unmistakable, growing louder with each passing moment. "Get your cameras ready," Sarah ordered, her voice a quiet command. The footsteps stopped. An unsettling silence followed. Then a door slammed somewhere deep within the house, sending the team jumping back. A heavy chill filled the air, and they instinctively huddled together. Rachel, her face strained with concentration, let out a breath. Something is here. Something that doesn't want us here. With no other choice, they pressed on. They entered the parlor, where the air seemed thicker, the atmosphere heavier.
The floorboards creaked beneath their feet, and every small sound seemed magnified. Suddenly, a faint laugh echoed through the room, chilling them to the core. It was low and hollow, a sound that didn't belong. "Who's there?" Sarah called out, trying to sound authoritative, but her voice trembled. No answer. But then Rachel's voice broke the silence again. "There's something wrong with this place, something trapped here." They moved cautiously into the next room, their flashlight sweeping across the crumbling walls. Tom's gaze lingered on a faded painting hanging crookedly on the wall. It was a portrait of a man and a woman, both dressed in extravagant old-fashioned clothes. Their eyes seemed to follow the team, a chilling reminder of the house's once grandeur, now long lost to time. "This place has seen horrors," Tom muttered, his voice shaking. "We should leave." But Sarah wasn't so easily deterred. "We're here for answers. Let's go upstairs." Reluctantly, they ascended the staircase, the wood groaning under their weight. And when they reached the second floor, the air became even colder. The house seemed to close in around them. Each room they entered appeared more decayed than the last. Finally, they came upon the master bedroom, its door hanging off its hinges. The room inside was eerily pristine compared to the others. The bed, though covered in dust, was still made as if someone had left it in a hurry. On the far wall, an old wooden chest sat, its lock rusted and worn. As Sarah approached the chest, she felt a sudden, intense pressure in her chest, an overwhelming sense of dread. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the latch. But before she could open it, the air in the room seemed to pulse. The temperature plummeted. Then, with a screech, the chest popped open, revealing a stack of old newspapers. The top one was dated nearly a century ago, its headline reading, "Tragic Murder at Hollow House. Family slain in cold blood." Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she read the details. The family of the house had been brutally murdered by an unknown assailant. But there was more, much more. As she turned the page, her eyes widened. The crime was blamed on the house itself. The victims had claimed that some dark force had pushed them to madness before the killings. Suddenly, a voice whispered behind her, "You shouldn't have come." Sarah spun around, but there was no one there. Her breath came in shallow gasps as the temperature dropped further. The walls groaned, and then, bang! A loud thud echoed from the hallway. The team rushed to the door and froze. At the far end of the hallway stood a figure, tall and shadowy, its face hidden in darkness. Rachel screamed, "It's him, the one who never left!" The figure took a step forward, then vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The house groaned, the sound of footsteps now louder than ever. But it wasn't just the house that was haunted. Something had followed them here, something that was far older and far more terrifying than any of them had ever imagined. With a final chilling scream, the team fled the house, leaving the hollow house to settle back into its eerie, silent grip. But Sarah, breathless and shaking, couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them out. Something still lingered, waiting. And perhaps, as the wind howled through the trees, the hollow house wasn't finished with them yet.